Welcome back to Open Heart Conversations, where we come together as community to explore the world's enduring spiritual and religious traditions. I'm your host, Reverend Dr. José M. Román, and I'm so happy to be back with all our viewers and our listeners. And with me is Bishop Heather Shea.
Thank you, Reverend José. I'm excited. What a topic today. So thank you all. Let's get going.
Yeah, it's extremely exciting. With us is also our very own Reverend Renee Rossi. Reverend Rossi, thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks, Jose. I love being here with all of you.
And today we are indeed exploring a fascinating topic, interspecies communication, animal communication, with a practitioner and a teacher of the art form, Nancy Windheart. Nancy, welcome to Open Heart Conversations.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here with all of you.
And let's begin with a very personal question. What inspired you to become so passionate about animal communication?
Well, animals have always been incredibly important to me in my life from the time I was a very small child. And like many children, I had very close relationships with them, and they also were my closest friends, really, and in the early years of my life. And so I understood them; they understood me. We understood each other, and that just really laid a foundation for this in my life. And at the time, I didn't think of it as anything unusual or anything special. It was simply my friends. I understood them. They understood me. And then as I grew up and became more enculturated into our society, I guess, I went on to have another kind of life, and always had animals with me, but never really thought about interspecies communication as a particular thing. And so I had a life and a career as an adult of being a professional musician and music teacher. And then I adopted my very first dog as an adult. And when he came to live with me, he really started to open up a lot of those things that I had experienced and felt and understood as a child. And I began volunteering at the shelter that he came from. And there was an animal communicator who also volunteered at that shelter. And I watched her work, and I listened to her communicate with the animals and translate for the animals. And it turned a light back on for me. And I remembered, like, I know this. This is how things used to be for me before life got really difficult and hard and complicated. And so that was the opening again of rediscovering this for myself. And so I had a period of time of about 10, 12 years where I was working professionally as a musician and a music teacher, but also doing a lot of work with animal rescue and studying and practicing everything I could about animal communication, and never dreaming that it would become what I would do professionally. That just evolved kind of organically and accidentally in a certain kind of way. But that's the short story. And really, it's the animals who have just drawn me deeper and deeper into this practice and into this work, and into just the passion for not just listening to and understanding them, but for helping other people to recover this ability and to reclaim this for themselves as well.
So Nancy, how would you describe animal communication?
How I like to describe it is that it's a universal language, that all species share a universal language, and each of us has our own species language, including all of the other than human beings, animals, and plants and trees. We're not just limited to animals, but each of us has our species language. But underneath that is a universal language that all species share. And it's not complicated. It's innate. It's our birthright. We all come in knowing this language. And what tends to happen for those of us who are here in human bodies is that we have our species language is so developed that sometimes we forget this original language. It gets buried underneath our written and spoken language and the particular way that our species communicates and thinks in relationship to each other. But it's still there. It's kind of gone underground for a lot of us. And so I like to think that what we're doing is just uncovering and recovering something that is innate in all beings.
And you talk about it sometimes as a kind of telepathy. Can you talk more about that in the universal language of being with animals, in particular being some sort of telepathy?
Yeah, so the word telepathy is actually interesting because if you break it down into its parts, tele, of course, is distance, and pathy has to do with feeling. So telepathy is feeling across a distance. And so that's really the essence of what we're talking about here, right? Because we can feel each other. I mean, even on this call, we're separated by time and space, and we're looking at each other with, little squares on a screen as we're recording, but we're feeling each other across a distance. And that's also what we can do with our other than human brothers and sisters. And so telepathy is really a way of feeling and understanding and knowing that doesn't rely on words, on spoken language. It's a way of feeling heart to heart, we might say.
So, Nancy, you speak about, animal communication, interspecies communication being innate in all of us. So does that mean that anyone can learn to communicate with animals?
Absolutely. And, I think of it even more than as learning, as relearning or uncovering, rediscovering, remembering. And just like with anything, that process can take practice, and it and some shedding of the layers that kind of prevent us from remembering and knowing what we came in with as our birthright, as just a living being here in this world. And so it can help to have some instruction and to have some training and to have some help and to have some guidance. But it's possible for everyone. And, and just like with anything also, different people have different levels of interest in doing that. Not everybody is going to be as excited about it as I might be, right? And different orientation and different level of commitment to it. But it's something that absolutely, it's innate, and uncovering that and remembering it is absolutely possible, I feel, for everyone.
Nancy, they say that communication really is a way of sharing our inner life, right? Sharing our inner life with someone else. We're sharing our thoughts, we're sharing our feelings. So in your work as an animal communicator, have you discovered that animals have different inner lives depending on the species? For example, is the inner life of a cat the same as a dog, or are dogs different from birds? Does the inner life of these animals differ depending on the species?
I would say it's not so much about the species, but about each individual. And so the inner life and what animals can communicate with us about, what they're interested in communicating about, what their experience is, what their perspective is, certainly that's influenced by how they live. In their bodies, whatever bodies they have. And so in that way, there can be a different orientation to life and different experiences depending on the species. But in terms of the inner life and what's available, I don't find that differs between species. In other words, there's no limitation based on species. What a dog may communicate about in terms of their experience of their life is going to be very different than maybe what a reptile who's living in the wild might share. But the capacity for communication about those things in any, just an infinite variety of things is not limited by species, in my experience.
Nancy, you've written that there are about 8 characteristics that that essentially can help, when exercised or expressed, can help someone become a good animal communicator. What I'd like to do is to go through each one of these 8 characteristics, just mention each one, and have you kind of comment on how that can help a person become a good animal communicator. Is that okay?
Sure.
So let's begin with the first one, humility.
So, when I made that list, of course, it's not a comprehensive list. There's probably all kinds of things that I could have included and didn't. But I think of humility as being a primary characteristic because it helps us to remember that as humans, we have a tendency to live in a culture that thinks of itself as dominant and as superior. And when we approach other beings and members of other species with an attitude of humility and recognizing that we come together as equals, not as in a superior inferior kind of dynamic, having that humility as humans can really help us in being open to what we might be able to hear and understand from somebody who has a very different experience and a very different perception than we may as humans. So I think it's really important to come to this practice from that place of just being humble and open and willing. And, as is the title of this series, open-hearted.
The second characteristic is really fascinating to me. You say that a good animal communicator should be willing to be transformed. Can you explain that?
Well, it's a big topic. I could go on and on for a long time about that. But really, what I mean by that is that this practice of listening deeply to another can and will change us. And I know for me in my own journey, this has been very, very much the case, that it really has transformed my life. It's transformed the way I think about myself, the way I think about the world, the way I think about others of my species. And so in that way, it can be a very deep spiritual practice. Of just really opening and being willing to have our perceptions and our habitual ways of thinking and doing and being be really shifted and transformed.
The third characteristic that you write about is clarity and accuracy. Can you comment on that?
There are a lot of people who come through my circle who want to train to do this work professionally in some kind of way. And so this characteristic of clarity and accuracy, when I wrote that, I had particularly in mind, people who really want to do this work in some capacity to help animals and other people. And so that requires a background of practice and study to make sure that we are actually hearing clearly and that we are actually hearing accurately and that we're not interjecting our own ideas and preconceptions onto an animal. And that's important. When people are first starting, I don't focus on that so much because we want to just prime the pump and get that muscle working of remembering. And so in the beginning, the clarity and accuracy is not so important as just really opening the channels. And then from there, we can start to hone in on becoming more and more clear and more accurate and receiving a more complete and full picture of what an animal is communicating with us.
The fourth characteristic that you write about is a person should have human communication skills. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, and again, that in context of talking with people who want to do this work to help others, right? When we're communicating with companion animals, and I prefer that term rather than pets, but there's a human person that is attached to them, and so when we're translating and helping a human and an animal to deepen their understanding of each other, we want to make sure that we are also empathic and able to listen in that deeper feeling place to the human person as well, because there's a dyad there's a relationship. And so it's not just listening to the animal, but it's listening to the person and their perspective in relationship to the animal.
The fifth characteristic that you speak to is neutrality and non-judgment. Speak to that, please.
It's really important that we learn, first of all, to identify what our own filters are, right? And, we all have our own preferences, we all have our own agendas, our own opinions, and none of that's a problem. That's just part of who we are. But it's important that we learn to kind of set those aside when we're really listening to an animal. And a lot of times, in our human world, we have all kinds of ways of perceiving that are very specific to our species. And if we really want to understand an animal, we want to just set those aside because they may have a completely different viewpoint from their perspective in their lives of whatever it is that we're wanting to understand more about. So that's what I mean by neutral. It's not so much being like blank, like we don't have to be devoid of feeling or devoid of emotion, but we want to be neutral enough that we can set our own perceptions and our own feelings and our own experiences aside so that we can listen fresh to what an animal might have to share with us.
The sixth characteristics is patience. Speak to us about patience.
Well, we're, as a species, we tend to be very impatient, right? We want things when we want them. And certainly other species members of other species may have that characteristic also. But when people are really developing this skill, what I really encourage them to do is to allow it to take the time that it takes. And so it's different than people who are wanting to do a course of study or training. It's different than a lot of our other kinds of schooling and disciplines where we have a program and we go through, and the harder we work and the faster we push, the more we accomplish. And this way of learning and relearning and remembering doesn't really work so well with that kind of an approach. What is much more helpful is to just be willing to take it slow and to be willing to explore and to be taught and to be quiet and to, really, it's a different way of being. And so it requires patience for most of us because it's different than the way we're accustomed to moving and going in the human world.
The seventh characteristic that you believe makes a good animal communicator are healthy boundaries. Tell us a little bit about healthy boundaries.
So, with, again, people who want to do this work to help others, it's important that people learn how to take care of themselves as practitioners. And so that can be anything from boundaries around time, boundaries around energy. There will always be more animals and people who need help than any one person has the capacity to help. And so that's important. And in my courses, I also, for people who are training to do this work in some kind of a professional capacity, I also really work with people on developing healthy energetic boundaries. So recognizing what's ours, what's not ours, learning how to open and close the doors of communication with intention so that we have capacity to modulate that we don't necessarily want to be open all the time. It can be overwhelming. And so, when we're first learning, a lot of times people they're so excited to open and to hear and to understand. And that's a wonderful time. And then there can also come a time where, walking down the street and being open to everything that's potentially coming in can be too much. And so we want to learn to have boundaries around that also. When are we open? When are we closed? When do we have permission to connect, which is really important? And when are we invited to connect? When are we not? What's appropriate? What isn't? So all of those kinds of things go into that bigger topic of healthy boundaries.
And Nancy, the eighth and final characteristic that you say creates or leads to good animal communication is compassion and empathy. Tell us a little bit about that.
I mean, I think it's the essence of good communication in any way, right? It's that ability to feel what another's feeling, to be open to feeling what another's feeling, and to recognize their experience, and to be willing to be with that in deep presence, and that is that can be practiced, that can be cultivated. And it's not always easy, especially if somebody is in pain or struggling or having a hard time. But that capacity to hold that space of compassion and empathy without being taken down into our own emotional river, I think is really important. It goes back to that, that balancing act of feeling, being able to feel, and also to have enough neutrality that we can set our own whatever it is aside to be really, really present with another being.
Thank you, Nancy. I just love that list of characteristics. And I've said this to you once before, because I feel anybody can use that to apply to any of their human relationships, as well as relationships with other species. So I love how universal the list is. You also, in addition to all the characteristics that make someone a great animal communicator, you also talk about 5 major things that can really interfere and make it more difficult. So I'd like to explore that list with you as well. The first thing you mentioned is distorted or human-centric attitudes, which you mentioned briefly previously, but if you could expand on that a bit.
Yeah, so we all have our own viewpoints, right? And, our own preferences and our own backgrounds, our own experiences. And a lot of times as humans, we tend to be somewhat blinded to those. And this can be true in our relationships with other humans also, right? We can be blind to the ways that our backgrounds and our families and our cultures filter our view of the world. And so the same can be true when we're in connection with a being of another species, that we can filter through our human experience. So our human experience of emotions, for example, or our human experience of how even something as simple as being two-legged beings who go through the world with our eyes basically in the front of our body and moving through the world in one direction. That's a particular experience that we may not even recognize that is not shared by other beings. And so it's really important to learn to just kind of set that aside and be willing to really fully experience and understand what perception, what understanding, what perspective might be like from a being who has a very, very different experience. And of course, this goes into helping to understand some of the conflicts and challenges that happen between animals and humans, right? And the misunderstandings that can happen, in interspecies relationships because of a fundamental misunderstanding of that kind of species-oriented perspective.
The second challenge that you mentioned is a frenetic and busy lifestyle. How would that interfere?
Pretty much in every way you might imagine, right? And so, because really learning to hear and understand animals and other than human beings requires us, first of all, to quiet the part of our human minds that is very busy and fast, right? So our human thinking mind, which is very helpful to us in certain ways in our human world, and getting to meetings on time, and getting to the airport on time, and all of that part of our human way of being that is useful in a certain way is not so useful when we're practicing this other way of being, of really listening and opening. And so our human lifestyle of being so fully scheduled, of moving all the time, of multitasking, can really detract from that quiet place of being and presence, which is that's the foundation that we cultivate to begin to really listen and hear. And so this is why practices like meditation practices, for example, are so helpful, because they help us with that. They help us in quieting and settling and slowing down. If we look at the way our animal brothers and sisters and kin are in the world, particularly the wild ones, right? We can learn so much from their way of being and moving, and it's very different than how we are as humans. And so I encourage people, as much as is possible, and it's difficult for all of us just in our modern cultures and the way we live, but to cultivate moments or times of quietness and presence and just that spaciousness, so that we can begin to hear and to listen at this deeper level.
It's a beautiful reminder, especially for those of us in New York City listening to this, like many of us are. The third category of challenges you mentioned is untreated or unhealed trauma, addiction, unsterilized psychological conditions. Can you speak to that as well?
I think maybe it was unstabilized.
Unstabilized.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, this is a big topic and probably more than we can really fully explore here. But what those kinds of things can, it's not that we have to be fully healed. But if we have, for example, a history of trauma, which so many of us, including myself, have, we want to have had enough support for addressing and healing that we can approach listening to and being with another being without that coming in as kind of an overlay. And the same thing, if we're struggling with addictions, that can really distort our perceptions. And so we want to take steps to heal those and to address those. And same with things like untreated or unstabilized depression or anxiety, or those kinds of things it can make it harder for us, because it's just like a filter that can it's an additional layer that can make it harder. So it's not that we have to have that all perfectly healed and fixed up. That never happens, right? It's a constant process of just working with it, whatever those issues are for each of us. But we want to have done enough work and have had enough support in our own personal healing journey and our own spiritual healing journey that we can be with all of that in our own experience, whatever that is, without having it being kind of front and center, because that's where it can interfere. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes. An awareness of what's happening within you.
Right. Exactly.
Absolutely. The fourth challenge that you mentioned is our human agendas, our ideas, our strong beliefs. Can you speak to that as well?
I mean, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, and it could be something as simple as, one of the examples I use with my students a lot is just a preconception about species, right? Or about breeds. So to use just a simple example, all Chihuahuas are yappy and they're going to nip at people's ankles, right? Well, that's an idea and it's a stereotype. And just as in our human world, stereotypes are not helpful and they can interfere with us really understanding one another. Sometimes people will speak about reptiles, for example, as well as, they're cold-blooded and so they don't have capacity to think and feel the way that mammals do. And that limits our capacity to connect with a reptile and find out, what do they perceive? What do they experience? As it turns out, there's a universe there of feeling and capacity. So any of those ideas that limit us will get in the way, right? And including the idea that we as humans are superior, or that we are the most biologically developed, that we have the most brain capacity simply because we have this particular ability to use language in the way that we do, for example, or that we are, the spiritual pinnacle of evolution, so to speak. Any of those ideas that we have will limit our ability to really fully hear and understand and be open to what's available when we are in connection with the being of another species.
And the fifth challenge I'd ask you to speak to is having strong emotions, like, for example, grief or guilt or fear.
Well, when we're having a really strong emotion, and this goes back to the thing we talked about earlier about doing our own personal healing work and having that awareness, right? It's not that there's anything wrong with having those strong emotions. Those emotions are important. But if we are flooded with a strong emotion in connection with another being, we're probably not going to get a lot except a reflection of that own emotion. So an example of, maybe where I see this happen a lot with people is if they're grieving the loss of an animal, a death. And that death is fresh and that grief is really fresh. And they want to connect with the spirit of their animal who is on the other side. And they want to feel that presence. But sometimes if that grief is so strong and so overwhelming, it's hard to feel anything but that grief. Or if we're working with an animal who has been traumatized, and we have so much of our own emotion about our own trauma that is triggered by the experience of this animal, it's going to be hard to really hear clearly and to feel that, because our own emotion is going to be so strong and so present that not much else can get through. And so the practice then is to really, first of all, allow ourselves to feel our own emotions and to go into those as fully as possible, but to maybe do that work first and then come back and listen when our own emotional state, whatever that is, isn't so strong. It can also happen with people. It's one of the reasons it can be hardest for people to feel like they can hear and understand their own animals really clearly, especially if there's something that they're really afraid about. So, and I know this is true for me as well. If I've got something going on with one of my animal family members that I'm really worried about, that fear and that worry and that uncertainty can make it really hard for me to be clear. And so that might be a time where I would call a trusted colleague and say, hey, can you help me with this? Right? Because my own stuff, my own worry is too much in the way.
Follow-up question that, and then another one. One is, so how do I know if I have something going on and I'm all consumed in that? How do I help myself, or a communicator go, just take a moment, or how do I know when that's happening, or I'm projecting my own stuff on the other species?
Yeah, I mean it's a important question, and I think we know in a few ways. first of all, through practice and through discovery, right? And so one of the ways that can be really helpful for us to practice is to practice with animals that we are not involved with and that we don't know. And to start with, what I call low stakes kinds of things. And, in my courses and my teaching, I give people a series of tools that help them to learn to connect. And that can be really important too. But, to start with low stakes kinds of topics and questions that can then be confirmed by somebody else, right? And so when you do that, you start to build the experience of, oh, that's what an authentic communication feels like. Some people will feel it very much in their body. Some people will get even kinds of physical sensations, maybe a sensation in their heart center or a feeling of, tingling or just a knowing, right? The authentic communication will often be very quick. It will often be something that you would not have expected. So it'll be surprising. It'll be a perspective that you wouldn't have thought of and didn't even know, perhaps. So all of those things can be markers of communication that is authentic and true. And then, conversely, if we're really flooded with our own emotions or our own ideas or our own ways of thinking, if we can practice learning to catch that and go, oh, wait a minute, I know this is a kind of a hot button issue for me, right? And I'm feeling myself getting kind of carried away and kind of hooked in. Wait a minute, I'm just going to recenter. And that practice, can be as simple as, okay, I'm just going to sit back, take a breath. I encourage people to, to sit back and kind of lean into the back of their bodies. When we're thinking a lot, we tend to lean forward and we're, we try to figure things out, right? And so just relaxing, taking a breath, settling back and down, reconnecting, and recognizing when we're kind of all worked up can be one of the first steps in helping us to identify the difference.
Could you give an example? You just mentioned when you teaches something simple, do you go, like I go to my cat and go, hi, how are you today? Or what are you feeling? Do you like your food? I mean, how do you, what are one or two things that you can do if you're just starting this kind of communication?
Yeah, so there's a few things that we can begin doing right away. And the first thing I would suggest is just to cultivate being present. And so really, it's like the foundation of so many other kinds of spiritual traditions and practices, right? Is just to cultivate, like just being with, not even trying to send or receive communication, but just being with your animal friend and without an agenda, just being present with them. And then the second thing might be just to open. Sometimes I use the analogy of like feeling your heart center opening and just connecting from the heart center to the heart center of your animal friend and just opening to feeling and receiving anything that comes through. So that might be, it might be a thought, it might be a feeling, it might be a picture. The communication can happen in a whole bunch of different ways. And that the telepathic communication is, the shorthand that I use for it. But once we start to recognize those primary ways that we receive, so for some people, it may be pictures. For some people, it may be emotions. For some people, it may be body sensations. So you may be just sitting with your cat, right? And just in that very present and open-hearted kind of way. And maybe something comes in like just a picture of the treat bag, for example, or somebody else might get the taste of that cat treat and what that feels like as the cat crunches it. And, it might be a really different sensation than when we eat our favorite treat, right? Just those are just simple examples, but, or we may get just a knowing of, oh, this is what's really important to me. It's really important to me when you and I sit, on the sofa together and, you're reading a book and I'm just sitting with you, or whatever it is, right? But that cultivating that capacity to be present, and then just to open in that open-hearted kind of way. I would say those are a couple of the first tools that I teach, and there's others as well, but that can give us a place to start.
I think my cat would like me to read this and come to your classes because he would like more treats. So right there, it's
maybe he was the one who gave me that example. Tell her about the treats.
About the treats.
Nancy, I love that you pointed out that, this presence thing is the foundation of a lot of spiritual practices. And that brings me to my next question. Do animals have a spiritual life? Like, what have you learned about that in your communication with them?
Oh, I've learned so much. And I would say the short answer to that question is yes. And just like us, it varies greatly by individual, by what animals, and I would include, we're using animals as a shorthand, but I would also include trees and all life, right? And so I think if we kind of decentralize the idea of spirituality from our human perspective of it, and think about what does that mean to have a spiritual life? For each of us, that's going to vary, right? But I think that in our human spiritual traditions, there's a common understanding of a spiritual life or spirituality connected to the idea of being connected to something that is either greater than ourselves, or that it's greater than our individual experience, right? And so, whether that's called God or oneness or presence, or whatever it is in whatever tradition, there's that kind of common understanding that that's what we're talking about when we're engaging in discussion about spirituality. So I've learned so much from animals about how they experience this communion with others, how they experience communion with the earth, how they experience that connection and that sense of oneness with the cosmos. I've had so many incredible experiences of being with wild animals. I'm thinking in particular of a time that I was with a group of humpback whales, and they were engaged in this incredible, it felt, the word that came to me to describe what they were doing was a prayer ceremony, where they were in connection with each other. It was a group of mothers and calves. And very much as I connected with them and could feel their energy, I was so aware that they were in this deep, reverential, meditative, holy state of being in connection with each other, and also fully aware of their environment, the water that they were in, and then the cosmos, all of the energy that was available. I mean, it was beyond what I could really take in from my human perspective. But it was so clear that what was happening there was something much deeper than simply the top layer of biology, right? And so that's just one example. I'm thinking of cats, that I've lived with, and a couple in particular who have what I might call a deep meditation practice, right? Of, going out onto the earth and just meditating and being with and connecting. And as I communicate with them what they're perceiving energetically and the levels of reality that they're in touch with, I barely have, I don't have language to translate it. But those are just some examples. And I think, we many of us have probably had the experience of animals opening doorways for us, or being with a tree that opens a doorway for us. or animals coming around us and wanting to be with us when we're in our own deep state of being. I think that's that it's such a rich topic. I mean, we could go on and on for hours. I'll stop there for now, but it's a never ending and really infinite exploration.
Nancy, this is a great follow-up question, I think, and it's something we've been kind of exploring. We had a conversation with you before this program where you said something that's very deeply related to what you've just shared. You said that animal communication is deeper than simple thoughts, that in a sense, the messages are, I think you said something to the effect of they're spiritual in nature. Can you speak to us about that? I think you were getting to that as you answered Renee's last question. So I'd like to explore it. What does it mean that the messages are spiritual in nature?
Well, and I don't remember exactly that language, but I think what I was getting at there was there's different layers at which we can communicate, right? And sometimes people get confused. They think if I'm not hearing a message, and generally the message is something that comes in human language and is something, kind of short and pithy, please give me more treats, right? Or, something like that. We certainly can hear those kinds of messages, and those are valid, right? And it's not to diminish that, but there is this other layer of deeper understanding and communication that is also possible. And I think maybe what I was referring to is that sometimes, we live in this soundbite culture, right? And this reality TV culture, where we want things to be kind of short and pithy and fast and cute and funny. And it's not that animals and other beings aren't capable of communicating in that way. They are. But there's this whole other layer of understanding that is available that for me is much more interesting. And much more compelling, and that's the spiritual nature of animals, the spiritual conversations that we can have with animals, those deeper nuances and layers of understanding that oftentimes can't really be translated into words, and they can't be translated into something, short and pithy, and so our animal friends are capable of a whole lot of layers of conversation and communication and connection. And I think it's important that we recognize that and not kind of, sometimes there's a tendency in our human world to infantilize animals as being only capable of communicating about certain kinds of things or in certain kinds of ways. And I think we want to be really careful about that and not limit them to that, because what they're capable of understanding and sharing with us is really limitless.
Nancy, when you reflect on on all your life's work and experiences as an animal communicator, can you share with us some of the major lessons that you've learned?
I think one of them would be to never assume anything, to never assume that I know something about another, or that I get something until I've really connected. And then that willingness to be completely surprised and to have my own perceptions really expand. That's one of the big lessons, I think. And it's this constant process of evolution and discovery. And going back to that word that we used in the beginning of transformation, really, this path for me has been a deeply transformative journey that I couldn't have imagined when I began, right? I just wanted to, understand my dogs better, and so I think that's one thing. And then, the other thing that I really can't have this conversation without talking about love. And I think that, love is something that it's hard to really talk about because it's so beyond the kind of limited two-dimensional capacity that we often kind of squeeze it into in our human world, right? But I think animals and other beings have taught me more about love and what it means to love and be loved and to be a living being who is here on this earth experiencing life in a body, and what is possible in connection with another. I think that's been the biggest lesson. And it's a continual and ongoing lesson that, you know, I'm awed by and I'm humbled by really every day.
Thank you. This has been and continues to be a remarkable conversation. Perhaps like some of our listeners, I came in really more thinking about my cats and treats, and animal communication people for me often think about their if you will call their cat friends or their animals that they live with, and it has expanded my thinking to keep remembering that it's all our friends. And recently, when I was meditating, I've been going through a transition, and for many, many, many days, in fact, a couple of weeks, I had a very large hawk show up, during my meditation. And it was whenever I would sit down, he would come in, and fascinating and very friendly and very much love. And one day, it was a beautiful day, so I walked outside, and this very large hawk comes in sitting right next to me, and I'm looking at his teeth and his claws. And there was just a conversation, and it was about love and about transition and about very much safety and about protection. And it was a very wonderful, powerful feeling. And I love that encouragement that when we really see all our animals that are out there and really what they all bring us and what we can learn from it, it's very powerful. So thank you for that reminder and that knowing.
Thank you for sharing that story. That's beautiful. And, it really highlights something that, maybe other people can find useful, which is that when we're in that state of being, for you, it was in meditation, and a lot of people who have meditation practices, find that that's one of the ways that they can access that state of being. Our animal kin find it easy to be with us in that way, because we're operating in a different way than kind of our normal human way of going, right? And so I found that to be true also, that, when we get quiet and when we open in that way, they go, oh, here, we can be with this one, right? And I'm going to show up, and I'm going to help her, and I'm going to connect with her in this way, because there she is, and she's meditating, and, and they can feel, they sense that state. And, it's true with wild animals, but also with our companion animals that we live with. And, that's something that people can practice and explore. And it doesn't necessarily require a formal meditation practice. If people have that and it's helpful for them, and it's something that's established, that can be one of the doorways. But sometimes I talk with people who say, oh, I can't meditate, I can't sit still, it's too hard for me. You don't need that. All you need is just that capacity to just be for a few moments in a receptive, open state of being. And then you'll start to see the beings around you responding to that and going, oh, wow, she stopped thinking and moving for a little while, right? This is great, now I can really connect with her,
Nancy, that makes me wonder, as human beings, can we directly ask other species for help in matters like this, matters of healing, transformation, transitions? Like, can we openly ask other species for help?
Yes, it's a beautiful question. And I think the answer is not only yes, but please do, right? Like, please do. And, it kind of goes to the bigger topic of where we find ourselves in our world right now with the relationship, the really fractured relationship that of our human species with the other species who share our planet, and the, very difficult situation that we are in globally because of that fractured relationship. And I think, for us to come with that attitude of humility and asking for help, And whether it's something in our personal life that we're working with, that we need support with, or guidance with, or understanding, we can ask our companion animals. We can ask the wild ones that we're in relationship with, like like the hawk, right? Or whoever it is. And then also, in the broader context of recognizing and understanding that other species have awareness and understanding that we maybe don't have as a species, and asking for their help in a broader way also, I think is really not only possible, but critical. Sometimes we think as humans, we have to figure out the solutions to all these problems that we have created. And while I think it's important that we take responsibility for those problems, we may not actually be capable of all of the solutions. There may be other beings that have better solutions than we do. And so that just asking for help and opening to that awareness, I think it opens this whole, again, this is another topic we could go on and on about for a long time, right? But just that humility and that openness of requesting. And in my experience, what I found in working with students, even like people who are just wanting to learn animal communication or relearn it, right? One of the first things I tell people is ask your animals for help. And once you do that, they will start to come forward. They'll go, oh, like she wants to, okay, I'm going to help, and they do. And so, yes, ask for help, be willing to receive that help, be open to that help. And it's available. And it's a really beautiful way of interacting and of understanding and opening the doors of our reception and perception.
It's really interesting. There's actually research that shows that animals have a sense of impending natural danger. For example, hurricanes, tsunamis, volcanoes. Animals have been known to actually respond to these literally at times 48 hours before they happen. It's interesting, if we were listening more deeply, how many human lives could be actually saved. And it's just saying that, it's just, it really, really, really resonated with me very deeply.
Yeah. I don't know if we have time, I could share a couple of examples about that, because, I remember being in a consultation with, I don't even remember who the animal was. I think it was a dog, but it was shortly before an earthquake. And I didn't know, nobody knew that there was an earthquake coming. And the dog didn't show it as an earthquake, but there's something really unstable. There's something really strange happening. I'm feeling things, I'm hearing things. And, and the person was in Northern California, I think at the time, and it was not long before there was a significant quake. So, absolutely that has happened. And another example from my own animal family that I didn't really understand until after the fact. I have a cat, his name is Louis, who's an elder now. He's 19 years old, and he is one of the beings that has taught me so much about spirituality. And he meditates, he goes on the earth, and as long as I've lived with Louis, he's had this incredible capacity to sense and feel what is happening with the earth. And I often say, I like, my primary job is to keep him fed and housed and well cared for. And he does something that, I barely can understand. But he came to me, I remember it so clearly, in the early part of 2020, before we knew really about the COVID pandemic. And he said, something is really strange out there in the world. There's something really unstable. It's really, really it's like something is bubbling up, is the way he showed it to me. And it has to do with the human world. And it has to do with an energy that it feels like it's becoming quite chaotic. And I didn't understand what that was at the time. And then, looking back, and I can't quite remember the timing of it all, but it was maybe, a a few weeks, at most, before we really started to understand and hear the first reports about COVID. And then I went back to that communication that he gave me, and I went, oh, I understand, like, now, and he didn't say there's this virus and it's, going to do this and it didn't come like that, but it was there's this energy that's happening, something's brewing, and he could feel it. And so, yes, to what you were saying. And, those are just some examples of how, of what our animal friends are in touch with, and those senses and levels of awareness that I think we've just lost them as a species. Maybe not completely. I think we have that capacity also, but for all the reasons that we've talked about already, that we've lost touch with that. We've lost track of that, and our animal friends can help us to reconnect in that way.
Nancy, this has been such a rich conversation, and I know that many of our viewers and our listeners are going to have a lot of questions and a deep desire to explore more, learn more. How can they do that? How can someone interested in interspecies communication, animal communication, learn more about it?
Well, the beautiful thing is that there are a lot of us who are doing this work in the world right now. And so there's a lot of different places to learn. There's books, there's courses, and, a quick internet search will give you all kinds of resources. If people are interested, particularly in the things that I have to share, you can go to my website, which is nancywindheart.com. And I've got some free materials, a free introductory course called The Basics of Animal Communication, where, people can just get their feet wet. And lots of material there on the website. And there's a lot out there. What I encourage people to do is to really, see what resonates and see what feels right for them. And I really believe people are drawn to the books, the writings, the teachers, the experiences that are right for them. And so it's just, some places to start and begin this journey. And, more importantly than anything, I would say, is start with your own animal friends. And, just as Renee was saying, ask for help, right? And there are tools and there are practices and there are techniques that we can use, but they're the best teachers. And they're available and they're ready to kind of welcome us back into the web of life.
Nancy, thank you so very much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. On behalf of the entire Open Heart Conversation spiritual family and United Palace of Spiritual Arts, thank you for walking us through this phenomenal conversation and this exploration.
Thank you so much. It's been a real privilege and pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bishop Shea, Reverend Renee, thank you so very much, both of you, for joining me here today.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Absolutely.
Yes, beautiful conversation.
To all our viewers and listeners, thank you for participating in Open Heart Conversations. Until next time, take care.